Have you ever asked yourself, is God speaking to me? Many of us long to hear God's voice, a clear sign, a whisper in the wind, a deep feeling that guides us in the right direction. But in a world filled with noise, distractions, and doubt, it can be difficult to recognize when God is truly speaking. Does He speak through dreams, through other people, through an overwhelming sense of peace or conviction? In today's journey, we will follow the story of a man struggling to hear God. Through 3 powerful encounters, he begins to understand the different ways in which the divine speaks and learns how to recognize God's voice in his life. Perhaps by the end of this story, you will recognize the ways God has already been speaking to you. In a small town nestled between rolling green hills, lived a man named David Parker. He was a good man, kind, hardworking, and faithful. He had gone to church his entire life, prayed every morning and night, and tried to follow God's path. But there was one thing that had always troubled him. No matter how much he prayed, he never felt like God answered him. David had heard stories of people experiencing divine revelations, dreams filled with guidance, or an overwhelming peace that came when they needed it most. But whenever he asked God for direction, he was met with silence. It had been like this for years. As time passed, doubt crept into his heart. He wondered, am I doing something wrong? Why does God speak to others, but not me? One evening, feeling particularly lost, David decided to take a long drive through the countryside, as he often did when he needed to clear his mind. The roads stretched for miles, winding through forests and open fields, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. As he drove deep in thought, something caught his eye. There on the side of the road stood an old wooden church. David frowned. He had taken this road dozens of times before, yet he had never seen this church. Curious, he pulled over and stepped inside. The church was dimly lit, its wooden pews aged with time. The scent of burning candles mixed with the faint aroma of old books. At the front, standing by the altar, was an elderly pastor, his presence warm and inviting. "You look troubled, son," the pastor said, his voice deep yet gentle. David hesitated. "I've been searching for answers," he admitted. "I pray, but I don't hear God. I ask for guidance, but He never speaks." The pastor nodded knowingly. "You are not alone in this struggle. Many seek God's voice, but do not realize that He speaks in ways we often overlook." He motioned for David to sit. "Let me tell you 3 stories, each one revealing a way in which God speaks. Perhaps by the end, you will understand how to hear Him." "Conviction," the pastor began. "There was once a woman named Sarah, a teacher in a small town. She had been offered 2 job opportunities, one close to home, stable and comfortable, and another in a distant city where she would teach underprivileged children. Sarah was torn. She prayed for weeks, asking God for an answer, but no voice came. No sign appeared. She grew frustrated, feeling abandoned in her decision. Then one night, she sat quietly in her room and thought about each path. As she imagined staying in her hometown, a strange discomfort filled her chest, a restlessness that she could not shake. But when she thought about moving to the distant city, something changed. A sense of peace washed over her. It was not an audible voice, nor a vision, but in that moment she knew the peace was God's answer. David listened intently as the pastor continued. God often speaks through peace and conviction. When you are struggling with a decision, pay attention to what stirs within you. God's voice may not always be heard, but it can be felt through a deep peace when you are on the right path, or an uneasiness when you are not. David sat and thought. Could it be that God had been speaking to him all along, through the very emotions he had ignored? The pastor continued. There was once a man named Jonathan who had fallen into despair. His business had failed, his family was struggling, and he felt as though God had abandoned him. One night in desperation, he prayed, "God, if you are there, give me a sign." But once again, silence. The next day, as Jonathan walked through town, an elderly woman approached him. She was a stranger, yet she looked at him with knowing eyes. She smiled and said, "God wants you to know that this is not the end. Keep walking." Jonathan was stunned. He had told no one about his prayer, yet this woman spoke the very words he needed to hear. The next week, another encounter, this time with an old friend, who told him the same thing, and then a pastor preaching on the same message. Do not give up. Keep going. Finally, Jonathan understood. God had been speaking all along through the people he placed in his path. The pastor turned to David. How many times have you dismissed someone's words as coincidence? Have you ever considered that God may be using those around you to answer your prayers? David thought back to moments in his own life, the times when his mother's advice had been exactly what he needed to hear, the moments when a friend's encouragement came at just the right time. Had he overlooked God's voice speaking through others? The pastor's voice grew softer. And then there is the story of a man named Daniel, a man like you, who longed to hear God but was met with silence. Daniel prayed every day, but no answer came. Months turned into years. He grew angry, wondering why God remained silent. Had he done something wrong? Was he unworthy of an answer? One evening, in a moment of frustration, he sat by a river and shouted, God, why won't you speak to me? And at that moment, the wind stilled, the water calmed, and everything fell into perfect stillness. Then in the silence, he felt it, a presence, an overwhelming peace. It was then that he realized God had been there all along. His silence was not absence, it was preparation. David's heart pounded. Sometimes God's silence is an answer in itself, the pastor said. He does not always give immediate responses because some lessons require waiting, growing, and trusting. David sat in deep thought. So God speaks through peace and conviction, through people, and even through silence, he asked. The pastor smiled. Yes, in many other ways. The key is to pay attention, to be still enough to feel his peace, open enough to hear his voice through others, and patient enough to trust him in the silence. David left the church that evening feeling different, as if a veil had been lifted. As he stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around him, and for the first time in his life, he felt it. Not an audible voice, not a miraculous sign, but a quiet, unshakable knowing. God had been speaking all along. David had spent years searching for God's voice, expecting a miraculous sign, a voice from the heavens, or a revelation that would shake his world. But what he learned that night in the old church was something far deeper. God had been speaking all along, just not in the way he expected. We often look for grand gestures, forgetting that God's voice is not always in the thunder, but in the whisper of the wind. We seek clarity, yet we ignore the gentle conviction in our hearts. We ask for a sign, but overlook the people sent to encourage us. We grow restless in silence, failing to see that God's greatest answers often come in waiting. Life is a journey of learning how to listen. The world is loud, but faith requires quietness. The future is uncertain, but God calls us to trust. The answers we seek may not always be immediate, but they will come in time, through the peace we feel, the words of others, or the quiet stillness that tells us we are not alone. Perhaps the real question is not, is God speaking? But are we truly listening? For those who learn to listen, his voice is everywhere.